Please welcome our panelists. So I'd like to start with a little bit of historical perspective. John, perhaps you can help us with this. Could you give us some background information on how the coca leaf came to be criminalized and slated for elimination under the UN 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs? And how might efforts to decolonize the drug treaties with respect to the coca leaf relate to other sacred plants and medicines from the psychedelic world?
Is this on? Yeah, great, thank you. So first, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be with you all on this panel, and that Chacruna, this event overall has been, so intellectually challenging, and I think a terrific space for cross-fertilizing these ideas. I'm going to speak about coca, and I think coca was, unjustifiably maligned by the 20th century and put on a list in the UN drug control treaty system that essentially bans even traditional uses of coca, like coca chewing. There have been some exceptions that have been hard fought and won, especially by Bolivia and indigenous groupings and communities in Colombia. So it's not that coca has been extirpated and eliminated, and traditional uses are alive and kicking. But the UN system was, in part, made to demonize and eliminate traditional uses, including coca chewing, which has at least several millennia, if not 8,000 years, of history with humanity. So humanity in the Andean Amazonian region co-evolved with the coca plant. And the idea that it could be eliminated in any form is nonsensical to begin with, but also deeply damaging. So the short story is that in the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, after the isolation of cocaine from the coca plant, the alkaloid cocaine, and its concentration as cocaine hydrochloride, the coca leaf itself became identified with and tarred with the same brush, if you will, the drug cocaine, and efforts were made, including not just in the United States and other global North countries and powers, but also westernized elites in the Andean region to define coca as the reason for what they saw as the backwardness of the dirty Indian in Peru and the Amazon region, and the Andean Amazon region more generally. So it's a tawdry story, and to put ourselves in the place of the thinking of 1920s into the 1950s, when the UN had an inquiry on the coca leaf, and the authors of that inquiry and that study said point blank, we know our vision is correct. We're here to confirm the truth that coca is what makes the Indian race backwards, and we, in their name, to call it paternalistic is to put it mildly, are going to end that problem by eliminating their traditional uses of coca. That position, even though they found that coca chewing was only a habit, not an addiction, was later adopted and embraced as one of the pillars of the 1961 UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which lists the coca leaf together with cocaine and heroin and other substances considered dangerous narcotics in Schedule I, which is the most restrictive control listing, effectively banning even traditional uses with a couple of exceptions. A 25-year so-called transitional or grace period to allow that effective ban to come into place, and some industrial uses exemptions, fertilizers, et cetera, that were not seen as large scale anyway, and for the Coca-Cola company, a built-in exemption that coca leaves could be exported if the cocaine were removed and the natural flavorings were still used in the Coca-Cola product. So with several tiny exceptions, the idea was that within 25 years of coming into force of the 1961 Single Convention, in other words, by the end of the 1980s, there would be no more traditional uses of the coca plant and coca leaves anywhere in the world, including in the Indian Amazonian region, where it has millennia of not just uses, but deep cultural, cosmological, spiritual connection to millions and millions of people. So the long story short is that this bid to eliminate traditional uses of coca was deliberately stigmatizing and criminalizing millions of people, and at the same time limiting, paralyzing, if you will, suffocating the benefits that the coca leaf as a patrimony of not just certain groups, but of humanity, to restrict those benefits to a small space and not allow the wider world to know and appreciate the benefits both nutritionally, but also in terms of the mild stimulation and well-being that the coca leaf provides. So that's a short story first. I mean, your second question is even a much bigger one, so maybe I should pause there and visit other parts of the conversation.
Sure. Let's pause there and come back to the second question. Victor, I'm interested in your perspective here. How might decriminalization of psychedelics intersect with broader liberation movements? And how can it support culturally relevant and community-led approaches to healing and rehabilitation with historically excluded communities?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think part of, starting with liberation, when I think about historically excluded communities, and part of what we're working towards when we are talking about liberation is really dealing with the impacts of colonization, which are still, similarly to what happened with the coca leaf, is what we've seen happen with a lot of other, substances that were used historically in the global South for different medicinal reasons, and through colonization and white supremacy and capitalism, et cetera. Those medicines found themselves on Schedule I or restricted, and a lot of these cultures had to hide their traditions or lose the connection to those traditions and those medicines to keep themselves safe. And so I think when we talk about, and then when we talk about the modern kind of state of these substances here in the United States, and the war on drugs that's continuing to impact and inflict violence on communities all across this country, decriminalization seems like the most viable path to allow these communities to safely begin to rebuild their relationships to these substances, and to work towards that liberation. And like for me personally, and for some of the cultures that I'm part of, there's no connection to these medicines, or it's so secret that even folks that are part of the culture don't really know about it because of the impact that the war on drugs has had, and colonization, et cetera. And so decriminalization really allows for folks to begin to feel safe in exploration, safe in building community, hyper-local community approaches to being in relationship with these medicines, and to take the science that's coming out and also to explore the historical context of these medicines and begin to build contemporary ways to be with these medicines in their communities in a way that makes sense for them. And so I see decriminalization as just as important as medicalization when we're talking about access, when we're talking about really addressing the historical harms to communities of color here in the United States, and really to enforce, or not enforce, but to support and encourage like self-determination. And we've seen there's places across the country where, for example, in DC, there's decriminalization, and one of the most beautiful moments that I've had as being part of this movement is seeing Black folks in DC being, being with these medicines and selling them to their community because it's decriminalized there, right? So, and finding ways to be with these medicines, finding ways to educate folks, and finding ways to build trust and within those communities. And so I think a lot of times when we talk about decrim, we take a patronizing approach, or especially when it comes to historically excluded communities. We overemphasize issues of safety and risk. While those are there, there's just as much there with other approaches as well. And so decrim really allows those communities to start to build those safety mechanisms, build harm reduction infrastructure within their communities, and really reestablish their relationships or build new relationships with these medicines that could really help to alleviate a lot of the suffering and the pain that these communities are facing.
Thank you. Tamar, how does some of the proposed and pending legislation in various states address regulated access for both decrim and medical models?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks again. It's exciting to be here on the panel with you all and this conference. I'm really happy to be invited to speak and to be here. So the area that I work, I come from a broader drug policy background, working on drug policy reform, and the space that I'm working in now related to psychedelics is around the development of state-level policies and state-level legal change. And I think I find myself there because in the past drug policy movements and drug policy reform, it's an area that's like ripe to be able to do a lot of good, because where the public is and where a lot of state lawmakers is in a different place than federal law and federal lawmakers, and the ability to move reform that either reduces punishments and penalties, and the vast majority of drug law enforcement happens on the state and local level to most people. So there's a lot of power in a state or locality to be able to reduce enforcement to have a broad impact. And then as we saw over the last 25 years with cannabis, there's actually an ability for states to, within limits, and we've learned some of those limits from cannabis, to develop models that can actually provide some regulated access in different forms and regulation of markets on the state level. So it's an area where I think because of that past experience and because of the politics of it, there's a lot of potential to move reform to both reduce harm for a lot of people because of the reach of state law enforcement, and also to create much broader access than we're likely to see through FDA approval or sort of a medical model on that level. So there's a lot of exciting things happening and a range of state approaches, bills that are out there and approaches that states have taken, everything from just providing money to do certain research projects to study commissions where states have, state advisory bodies examining the issue and making recommendations, to decrim models, decrim on the local level, some maybe we'll say a statewide decrim bill. I mean, California got one through the legislature into the governor's desk, but it was vetoed. And then we have 2 states that have adopted, actual regulatory models that provide, a licensed and regulated process to produce psilocybin in Colorado is still underway, but a broader set of substances provide a regulated product where a person adult will be able to use it in an actual licensed facilitated space. Those are still in the developmental stage, I would say. I mean, Oregon is rolling out, but it's also learning and modifying. And there's a lot of other states now looking at exploring those types of models. So I think there's great potential there. I'm of the view, and we saw this with cannabis too, that it's like the class example of states as laboratories of experimentation. They're trying different approaches. We'll be looking to each other to learn what works and what doesn't work and modifying as it goes along. There's also, I think, very large limitations to the approach that we have to deal with that are difficult, and I think we've learned the difficulty is that we've seen some of the outcomes in past drug policy reform movements, and we see with cannabis, in that it's not just a blank slate where we get to sit and develop the best policy based on research and evidence and input from people most affected. It's a political process. So we deal with ballot initiatives. It has to be what the voters want and what the voters think to enact it. Legislatively, we're dealing with the lawmakers' interests and focuses, the politics of the state. And then there are very serious limitations of federal law in terms of what the state can do. So it's very easy for a state to remove state law penalties. A state cannot change the CSA. They can't authorize a violation of federal law. They have to work around these federal constraints in a way that is actually not conducive to good policy or goals or outcomes on the state or the federal level in terms of what they want, and can really muck things up and make them quite difficult in the end, which we're still seeing some from cannabis. And I'll just quickly add, I think one of the interesting things about it so far, I think, and something for us to think deeply about in how we develop the policies and what's possible is, and this is also because I worked on cannabis for 15 years, so I'm going to say the relevancy of cannabis and what we've learned in that space. On the one hand, a lot of moving into it, it's obviously completely different from cannabis, right? Substance is different, how people use it, what the regulatory model, the interests, the stakeholders are very different. But I've come to realize that there's two things. One, there's a lot of lessons learned in cannabis because we deal with the same state-federal conflict and the limitations of what a state can do and sort of the political process that is there. So that's actually quite useful. We see states introducing models where they're a doctor will prescribe it, and then you'll go to the pharmacy and get it. And we have to say well, actually, we can show you pretty concretely that won't work, because we tried that initially in cannabis and it didn't work at all. So we have some guidelines as to what we can do. And we also have to deal with the fact that people now have a perception of drug policy reform in their mind that is related to cannabis. So when we were doing cannabis, people were thinking about alcohol or the war on drugs or whatever their perception of cannabis was. Now when we talk about regulated access to the next substance or reducing penalties, people are thinking about cannabis. And it takes a lot to say, no, maybe it won't be dispensary on the corner. Maybe people want it to be that. People are very quickly to go to medical cannabis and say, let's do a model that looks just like medical cannabis, because we did that and it worked out great. And they say, did it work out great? Is that what you think about it? So that's the point of reference for many people that we're talking about, lawmakers, that we have to kind of deal with and navigate with. And then I think for us in developing the policy, we have a lot of lessons learned about what those policies looked like. I mean, the goals of equity and how it turned out, that I think were very fundamentally rooted in the type of model that we started from the beginning, and the forces of capitalism that were beyond control of some things that we devised. I think we can look at some of the most successful elements, which have been reductions in arrests, and say those pieces worked. I think there's areas where we can see a lot that there's really under-regulation in cannabis that's harmful to consumers, and then areas where there's really over-regulation of cannabis that's harmful to the market and people's ability to come into the space. So even though it's quite different, I do think there's a lot of things we can take from it as we try and devise state policy models. But once again, I think one of the biggest challenges is grappling with the politics around it and the education and knowledge base of moving how the sausage is made when you make a state law, and sort of the compromises in the development and what we end up with in the end, and making sure that it's still, a reform that really advances justice and access and equity and our overall goals.
Thank you. David, what are the relative virtues of self-regulating psychedelic plant and medicine communities in a decrim context? I imagine you have some thoughts about this. Alongside regulated access programs to psychedelic healing.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. Yeah, so I think regulated access, the virtues there is most of the psychedelically naive population needs to see a well-regulated access point to avail themselves of the healing these medicines provide. They're not going to be comfortable joining a self-regulating community by and large. Thinking about like our parents, that they just need to see something that looks like what's coming out of Johns Hopkins, and they're not going to feel safe and comfortable without that. And that the regulated access model indexes hard on safety and accountability for facilitators, training of facilitators, proper preparation, medicine that's, the dose. It's great in that regard, but all that comes with a cost. And, what we're seeing in Oregon is, for the, cheapest group rates, it's about $1,000 to access. And group therapy is one way to really overcome some of the accessibility barrier. It's certainly like much cheaper than one-on-one therapy and arguably more efficacious for many indications, not all, but the mutual camaraderie and support and accountability healing and community provides is great, and it's cheaper, but not that cheap. And so then there's efforts to make that more accessible. I'm on the board of the Sri Eckert Foundation, and we're raising $1 million to help subsidize not just facilitators who are BIPOC and LGBTQ, and you get a good spectrum of culturally accessible facilitators, but also now supporting clients and providing sponsorships. And but ultimately, self-regulating community use, outside of that regulated framework, is much more economically accessible. Being able to grow your own medicine and sit for your friends, and go out in the forest, and then importantly to form self-regulating communities. Heard a lot from the Sacred Plant Alliance and the different churches. I'm really excited about that access point. It's an all 50 state play. Regardless of whether or not you have a DSM diagnosis, although I would say that the regulated access programs, as Tamar said, at the state level relative to federal FDA, you don't need a formal diagnosis, and they do, and also it's all about the screening, the safety screening, and if you have a history of psychosis or paranoid personality disorder, what are the contraindications. So in the unregulated space, or in the self-regulating, so then the challenge becomes, well, how do you promote safety? With, as Victor says, population, because of the drug war, we've been cut off from these medicines. We don't have the relationship, and we have to figure that back out. And so the Sacred Plant Alliance is a really great example of responsible entheogenic churches coming together to share best practices on screening protocols and facilitator training and escalation protocols, and as well as legal posture. And that's one way to really promote it. But here in California, last year our decrim bill was derailed by a very powerful new group, and it's just really tragic. Like the most tragic fate that can befall anyone is mothers losing their children. And in this case, Kristen Nash and Susan Seiji both had children have basically die out of psychedelic extremists, not directly because of the medicine, but they were in psychotic state. It spun out. In one case, the first responders responded in a not a good way, and the situation escalated and resulted in the fatality of the child. And then in the other, ended up taking their life. And so they're not actually, they believe in the healing power of psychedelics, but they want there to be education about the very real risks, that as transformative and profound as these experiences can be, they can be extremely destabilizing and even lead to life-threatening psychosis. So it's really about, okay, like in addition to Sacred Plant Alliance, what are some other ideas out here that we can, decriminalize the medicines and make them accessible in all the ways Victor says. I mean, it's important because you can't tell a lot of the population to go pay $1,000 to avail themselves of these medicines. And so in addition, I actually talked to Kristen and Susan about a flyer, designing a flyer together, in coalition, that would attend decriminalization policy and would basically say medicines can only be shared when accompanied by this flyer. This is kind of best practices 101, the do's and don'ts of safe psychedelic journeys, and be with trusted friends, don't trip alone, don't be in a crowded space, don't watch TV, and then when which literally happened, like a foster daughter came in with her boyfriend like a couple years ago and said, "Oh yeah, we tried mushrooms and yeah, it wasn't that great, just watching TV." I was like, "Wait, what?" And you just realize like the dearth of education out there. So that's what they wanted to see, and so basically the governor, we can surmise all the different factors at play, including his presidential run and not wanting to take a position on a controversial subject. But he basically vetoed our decrim measure, but in his veto message said, "Okay, bring me a regulated access program," and which the coalition then has introduced this year, along with a public education campaign. A public-private partnership fund will be set up that will fund education of first responders, but also of seekers and users, and with a real attention in college settings. And then hopefully then we would then have follow-up decriminalization policy that would follow that up in a year's time or something. And maybe coming with a flyer, this additional flyer idea. And I just want to also shout out Allison Hoots was sharing this New York legislation where they're actually requiring people to pay like $40 for a permit, and you got to take this like test, like your driver's license, and just get the basic, do's and don'ts about engaging with these medicines and basic dosage and this kind of thing. And the result of that is you get the permit that allows you to have these medicines and engage with them. And that sounds really good. So so I feel like there's some really good strategies in play to address the, shortcomings of decriminalizing in a population that's largely lost touch and knowledge with these medicines.
Thank you. How do you feel about the prospect of this new legislation making it through the legislature in California?
I mean, on the surface, I feel really good, but it's been kind of crazy to see just how difficult it's been. We actually just suffered, like we were about to be killed in I forget which committee, but Wiener had to make a snap deal to save it, and basically excluded, basically said only credentialed individuals with, there was like a roster of, mental health professions and substance abuse counselors, and, only these people are eligible to be trained in this regulated access program, which is really unfortunate because a lot of the best facilitators are coming from the underground and they're not credentialed. Indigenous leaders, they're now excluded. The team is strategizing to get religious professionals added so that, at least we can do that. But Oregon only I think less than 25% of facilitators trained so far are credentialed in the way that California is now restricting. So, but hopefully we'll be able to fix this. But it's definitely been way more challenging than, decrim was sailing through. And maybe Tamar can speak to the differences.
I'll just add, I think it's, it's still early days, I'd say, on the California legislation, so hopefully it develops and evolves. But there's definitely a different set of challenges, I think, moving a complex regulatory bill than a decrim bill. So decrim, people have concerns about, the danger, the lack of regulation, or what might happen. And then with regulation, you're setting up a large state program that is, and this is where I said people's ideas about, is this going to be like cannabis? I'm kind of down with cannabis, but we don't want another one. We just did this whole thing. It's a big cost to the state. The state takes on a role in, ensuring a level of safety for people who come to it. There's an expectation of what a state-regulated product is like. So it brings on a new set of issues, I think, to grapple with, that lawmakers have concerns about, that need to be addressed, and that are really complicated. So I think we're seeing decrim went through, but it's not necessarily the same people. Just because you supported decrim, you're going to support this regulatory model, or just because you supported the regulatory model, you would support decrim.
To be seen. I'm interested in following up on the question of who gets to participate in the regulatory model, and who gets to set the terms of engagement. I think this is a question, Victor. How can policymakers involved historically excluded communities in the decision-making process here, and including the regulation and implementation of psychedelic frameworks, and make sure that their voices and needs are addressed?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think before I transitioned into this space full-time in March of 2022, I worked for the governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf, at the time, and I was the deputy director of the Office of Advocacy and Reform in Pennsylvania. And what I realized when I got to state government there was that a lot of times I would be in meetings where there was conversations about food stamp benefits, Medicaid, all of these different programs that impacted the community that I came from, and that were benefits that only a few years before I got to that position and my entire childhood, my family and myself benefited from to make it through life. And time again, when those conversations would be happening, although there were a lot of people in the room with good intentions and a lot of theory about the implementation and how it would look and how it would impact and help those communities, the room was usually full of white folks that were upper middle class or didn't have a direct experience with those communities or those benefits themselves. And so a lot of times an example of that would be they would increase cash benefits and it would push people over the cliff, and then people would lose all of their benefits. So instead of helping, it would actually end up kicking families off of the benefits that they needed. And so I tell that story because it's impacted a lot of how I think about policy. And so when I look at the psychedelic space and how we engage in conversations with communities that are most impacted, usually, for me anyway, it seems like we come to them when we need to get something across the finish line, or because we're rushing to scale something or pass something and we need to act like we actually talk to those communities so that we can quiet them down and get the thing across that we're trying to get across. And then what happens is the thing passes and it's inaccessible, it's harmful. Those communities continue to be over-policed or violently punished for being with those medicines in certain ways. And so I think it's, you have to start to build like authentic relationships with those communities and with the leaders in those communities, and actually bringing people to the table and listening to stories and implementing that and having them involved in the entire process rather than just kind of checking a box so that we can get the legislation across, right? And also just centering stories. So one of the things that that I'm doing in the psychedelic space as a culture building is working on this film that explores the reemergence of these medicines from the perspective of people of color through a lens of hip hop, and it tells the stories of our scientists, our community practitioners, our everyday people who've been in prison and came out and aren't recidivating because of their relationship with these medicines, hip hop voices, and really trying to educate our community, but also like to tell our story and to communicate what we need in a collective way. And thank you, David, for your support of the film. So I think we need to really start to build authentic relationships. And I think it's difficult with policy because we can fold into the, politics can be pretty cutthroat, right? And so a lot of times what happens is folks are used for their story or asked what their opinion is, and once we extract that, it's kind of like they're thrown to the side. And we see that time and time again, not only with psychedelic policy, but with policy all across the board. And so, yeah, I think it's authentic relationship building. I think it's finding trusted community leaders in those communities that have a track record of being in integrity and really caring for those communities and working towards liberation, and then ensuring that at every step of the way, those communities have a voice and have power over what legislation, implementation, regulation, et cetera, looks like.
Thank you. So let's get a little bit more concrete about that. This is a question for the entire group. How can laws and policies empower historically excluded communities to have greater control over their own drug policies, including the ability to implement community-based harm reduction strategies? Who would like to take that question on?
Well, I think Victor was speaking to this in his opening remarks, that decriminalization as a policy is what enables communities to come together to share best practices and promote and advertise safe use, safe healing circles without threat of legal jeopardy. And without that, it's very difficult to be communicating in any kind of public way. But it's just like, well, as we decrim, how do we do this in a way that does address some of the downsides? But ultimately, that's the policy that we need to enable communities to, effectively organize and share information in a way that, isn't to their jeopardy. I just want to also add that, I talked about the economic accessibility being, the real advantage with self-organizing community access, but arguably the long-term emotional and mental health of people who belong to these communities is much better. And that's why I say that these are very complementary. I mean, regulated access is great, again, for most of the people are psychedelically naive, but I mean, this is, the idea that you're gonna have one psilocybin session and, be cured of your mental health challenges for the rest of your life is, wrong. You can make a lot of progress, especially with acute trauma and grief in a single session, but generally speaking, this is a lifelong relationship, and expecting people to pay regulated access rates, annually or whatever the rhythm makes sense for a person is ridiculous and not gonna happen. So, and being in a self-regulating community, religious or secular, where you have that mutual accountability and support, but the community is the medicine. And over the long haul, and growing the medicine together, and it's just much more economical. And so I think, and I'll do a shout out. Heroic Hearts has a group model going through right now of veterans that are healing, that prepare together. It's like a 6-month program. They're preparing together. They get some individual sessions, but then a lot of group sessions. They drink the medicine or take the psilocybin together. I think it's like 3 facilitated sessions, and then some real integration follow-up in a 6-month kind of cohort. And and that's just great, because you think about that not only for veteran trauma is this such a awesome way of forming lifelong bonds that will be the medicine going forward, but just that length and span of time is applicable to a lot of other indications. People are suffering from alcoholism or substance use disorders. This is a great model that could work for them. And the idea you can detox from an opiate addiction with ibogaine, but it's a detox. It's not it's not going to cure you of your underlying emotional pain and trauma that made you an addict in the first place. And you need to take that time. And hopefully we'll be able to show over time that these are cost-effective, efficacious interventions, and get Medicaid to cover not just single session psilocybin, but actually this is standard of care is this 6-month program in a group process. But yeah, just want to share those additional thoughts.
Thank you. Anyone else on that?
Sure. I can come back to the question of coca, but in the cannabis space as well, to ensure that the solidarity and the attention to reducing harms and ensuring inclusion, even in what we consider the medical or medicinal cannabis space, and to recognize that traditional growers or legacy growers in the U.S., but traditional growers in the Caribbean, in Colombia, and in Morocco, for instance, to the extent that medicinal cannabis, which is as far as their countries are able to go now, mostly because of U.S. and other country pressures, if the line for regulation is drawn in such a way and the barriers to entry into that newly legal market that could provide benefits to them and their communities, if that line is too hard and those barriers are too high, they won't be able to participate in the market or in the potential benefits. And to the contrary, where the new rule line is drawn is going to leave them outside and still subject to not just stigmatization, but in fact criminalization and enforcement. And I think it would be a real tragedy, and we see it in the making, that moving beyond prohibition, even to adult use or recreational, would have the effect of doing what prohibition has long been unable to do, which is to take big chunks of that formerly illicit market, put it into the hands of legal, sort of legitimate interpreters and actors, but leave less and less space for them and continue to criminalize the traditional growers who have long supplied our global north and other illicit markets. So in terms of harm reduction, one key frame is to acknowledge the role that traditional producers have played, and to, as we envision more advances internationally in terms of cannabis legal regulation, Germany has just taken steps that has a different model than the US for now, but to recognize the role of traditional growers and producers in supplying those markets, and knowing that a domestically sort of hermetically sealed market in, say, the United States or Germany or any other country is not going to replicate what was there and is potentially going to block out and lock out the traditional growers, so ganja in Jamaica or what have you, that have every right to a livelihood, especially because their recourse to those illicit crops and the extent to which it has been a bulwark for their survival is because the rules that we've made on trade and other commodities have stripped them out of their livelihoods. Bananas in the Caribbean, say corn and maize in Mexico. So there's a lot to unravel there, but I think we in terms of US focus groups especially, need to keep that solidarity dimension in view. And with respect to coca, where there is now an opportunity for greater inclusion of, especially of indigenous peoples, in an opportunity to remove coca from these UN treaty schedules, thanks to a Bolivia-instigated WHO critical review of the coca leaf and its status, something that should have never happened, and has something that has never been revisited, certainly not in the view of modern science. So that review is now underway, and it affords, and it will require to succeed, full inclusion of indigenous peoples and their communities and their perspectives, not that there is a monolithic perspective by any means. So this review is underway. Within 2 years, member states at the UN are probably going to be voting on those recommendations. So this is an opportunity collectively to ensure that there is not just tokenized participation, but full inclusion to be represented in something that will be surely a challenge for the WHO, and we can get to this question of blowing up the traditional views and structures of what is medicinal, what is scientific, what is otherwise legitimate. But I think there is a big opportunity. It's by no means guaranteed to succeed, but if there's not full and genuine inclusion of indigenous peoples in particular, but not only, it's hard to see how it can succeed. The next steps from there would be, if there is a good recommendation from the WHO, ensuring that countries vote for it. Failing that, have a plan B to allow for international trade anyway. And if that happens, to ensure that this new market, these new market opportunities in international trade have protections afforded precisely for those cultural and traditional and spiritual components of meaning for the traditional growers, but also so that those meanings aren't dispersed and lost as the benefits are truly spread. And just to say about the coca leaf and coca products, they would be distinct from cannabis and distinct from psychedelics in the sense that you wouldn't need certainly a prescription. They could be in the store. Think more like teas or caffeine, a much more pleasant and better version of coffee.
Oh,
I like coffee, by the way.
We're looking forward to that. So, Tamar and Victor, how can policies acknowledge and address the historical injustices and systemic oppression that have disproportionately affected marginalized communities in the context of drug criminalization? What concrete steps can be taken by policymakers?
Such an easy question. I mean, it's a challenging question. I think, I've been obviously involved in a lot of conversations that are looking back at evaluating cannabis and what we tried to do in that space, some of which hasn't worked or hasn't worked its way out yet. One piece, though, that I think there's more agreement about the success of some of it in places that have done it is around the reinvestment of some tax revenue, states that have done that, and directly kind of giving money, especially states that have a more participatory process of where that money goes and grants directly to communities. That's a big difference in the regulatory models that we're looking at here versus cannabis is that they're not revenue generating in the same way. So that's challenging. I think a piece, so that this is less sort of tangible, but I think it's an opportunity, and I think cannabis did this some for an actual shift in thinking and an acknowledgement and the framework of that we look at drugs. So I think cannabis moved conversations. There's a few local cannabis tax programs that are directly designed as reparations. And so I think that moved forward, the ability to do that kind of policy in a way that maybe in other contexts has been harder, met a little bit more of a wall. I don't know. I think one challenge, and thinking about what we just talked about in the design of the programs that I struggle with, I don't know the answer to it, is how much should be included in a state law or policy versus exist outside of it. I get worried about including terms about community and legacy provider and religious exemption in the context of the state law, because then who then gets to define those terms and implement it, and then it's ultimately in a court deciding what is in a category, out of a category. I think in the context of cannabis, and I think this is just in the U.S., the nature of sort of capitalism and entrepreneurism. I think there's a lot of exploitation of any sort of exemption to regulation or lesser standard that it encompasses a group that it's legitimately designed for, but then it's viewed as an opportunity for others, and they go into that space in a way that can be very damaging and distorting of what the intent was. So I struggle with that and designing the laws about how to better protect things by including things and terms to address it within the context. And of course, we want to create a system, if we have an advisory committee or a regulatory process, that it's as inclusive from the beginning to the end, as Victor was talking about, of voices. But at the same time, it's still within government, still within a government process and our laws, and codified that way, ultimately interpreted by the courts and subject to lawsuits and things that is, that in of itself is sort of outside the intent and only a certain ability to control it versus not touching something, an area that maybe we don't legislate in that area and we have different avenues and paths towards, creating a safer space or repairing harm. So I don't know, that's not the answer to say, I don't know what the answer is, although I think it felt complicated at the beginning of cannabis, and it feels 10 times more complicated now, and in this space even more complicated, but it's something that I just, in my role as a lawyer and in drafting laws and thinking about what goes in the law and what stays out of the law and how you define terms, I really struggle with, because I worry about including things in a law that then end up being distorted by sort of the powers that be or the system in which we've placed it, and whether there's better things that would stay outside. And I think even with cannabis, and then I'll shut up and let Victor give us the real answers on what we should do, with cannabis, I look back and say, like, well, California, would we have been better with a decrim model for longer or permanently than the regulatory model we have? And, there's huge pros and huge cons to both. But I think that's something to think about in this space, about how regulated, how structured you want certain aspects of it to be or not. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think I was in a conversation yesterday that talked about in New Jersey, cannabis is legal at the state level by licensed, distributors, but marijuana under the state law is illegal. So like cannabis is like regulated and marijuana is everything outside of that. So I think that's just like one example of like how multi-state operators and other folks, get a hold of or, have power to kind of shift how things are actually implemented and end up impacting communities. I'm neurospicy, so I'm gonna need the question to be repeated so I can.
How can policies acknowledge and address the historical injustices and systemic oppression that have disproportionately affected marginalized communities in the context of drug criminalization?
Yeah, so I think all policies should center the most impacted folks, and when that happens, we all win. And so I think, for sure, like decriminalization, legalization, descheduling is a big part of that. Retroactive or restorative efforts to expunge records, with psychedelics, that's not so much a problem with BIPOC or historically marginalized communities in terms of like versus what we see with cannabis. But I think generally policies, I think should focus on what's going to have the most impact on the drug war at large, and how can we then once we identify that, then how can we be most inclusive of that in psychedelic policy while centering the most impacted folks? And so again, like I think like decriminalizing, descheduling, making sure that folks who have records are being those records are being expunged so they don't continue to have issues. But also, like, look, there's people that are doing life in prison right now for cannabis. That's just like fucking ridiculous. And so I think like those kind of issues, when we focus on those, like ultimately are gonna impact how the psychedelic space rolls out. And so really we should be looking at kind of like how do we address those harms that are actively happening and have happened, so that they're not repeated when we're implementing newer policies around psychedelics and rolling these models out. So yeah, that's my opinion.
All right, bonus question. And here's one reflecting my bias as a journalist. What is the most underreported story in psychedelic policymaking that you think should be amplified? And that is for all the panelists.
Well, I definitely think the religious use, churches, that's the secret tsunami and sweeping the country. I don't necessarily think it will benefit from more reporting, and maybe it's better that there's not. But I did love the Rolling Stone article on the Divine Assembly in Utah, and shout out to Steve here, and just that was amazing to just see, and he let me know that they've got 15,000 members now. And yeah, I mean, this is, the reddest of the red states, having basically legal access. So I think that's really underappreciated, that this access point is sweeping the country. And yeah, there's just a lot of churches here in the room, and just, I think that's underappreciated in the movement and how powerful that is. And, like Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, really believed in psychedelic as part of that process, of your healing process. And AA is often in a faith community. And, I just think that's going to be really big. I did, also just wanted to augment John on the coca. I actually was just on a call with Open Society and River Styx Foundation about just this, and about, funding a campaign to help, deschedule it out of this, I guess, WHO process. And it's, it's been on my radar for a bit, coke is great. I mean, for those who don't know, like the Mumbai, and it's like really sustainable, clean energy, like less jittery than caffeine. And it's not, cocaine's like a real up down kind of thing, but the Mumbai is like really amazing. And the peasant, the indigenous farmers would benefit so hugely, like instead of getting Roundup dropped on them all the time, but they actually benefit in a fair trade system supplying, markets for like an incredible array of coca products. I mean, it's amazing. And there is sacred use of coca. And just the other thing about all this regulated or decriminalized is like the demand pressure on these medicines is spiking globally. And we're supporters of the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, as well as Chacruna's Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative, and think this is really important that as more and more people are availing themselves of the medicine, that the traditional medicine traditions, that this is to their benefit, that they're, still have access to their medicines, their cultures aren't overly disrupted by tourism, it's on their terms, to their benefit, and not disrupting things further. So that's also important to keep in mind as we decriminalize and make these medicines available. How are we showing our respect and gratitude to these traditional medicine holders and their cultures? And I was just in Gabon and going deep with the Babango people, with Iboga, and it's just amazing. And just want to make sure that Iboga, like peyote, is endangered in the wild, and need to make sure as we're healing all this trauma and doing all this good work that it's not, to the detriment of these communities.
Victor, what information would you like to see amplified that is not being talked about?
BIPOC voices, BIPOC stories, BIPOC contributions to this space. And also I think I think for good reason there's concern around safety and risk, et cetera, when we talk about decriminalization or access that's outside of a regulated model, but my people are dying. Our communities are being decimated from all different angles by these systems. And so I think that when we talk about those risks and safety, which are very legitimate conversations, we also need to talk about the violence and the pain and the despair and the ongoing the ongoing violence that's destroying our communities, systemic injustice, et cetera. I don't see enough coverage about these issues or about those voices or stories in the media at all, or rarely. Yeah.
John?
Yeah. So I'll stick with coca, but then I'll broaden it as well. I think to understand the opportunity with respect to coca is to first appreciate that coca, in our awareness, has the campaign to eliminate it succeeded in one way, eliminated from our awareness. And I think that's a real loss. So I think we stand to gain a lot if this campaign to remove it from the UN control schedules can succeed. But I also feel that we cannot, in the name of liberating the coca leaf, we cannot throw cocaine under the bus in the sense of perpetuating the idea that the war on drugs has a correct purpose. And I think there's two key elements there. One is that to the extent that the coca leaf is removed, decriminalized, if you would, and it provides these new, vibrant, and useful, helpful, beneficial markets and use around the world, that doesn't mean that coca will not still be cultivated illicitly to produce cocaine. So I don't think we should labor under that illusion, because prohibition will guarantee, so long as it is intact, that cocaine will remain immensely profitable and lucrative, and it will feed those engines, and it will continue to feed the engines of a repressive drug war that will in no way address the underlying problems and needs, but will perpetuate the harms that we all are very well aware of. So let's, in seeking to liberate the coca leaf, not forget about the wider and longer term objective of legalizing and regulating access to cocaine and other more dangerous drugs. And all we have to do is look at fentanyl and synthetics today to know what the logic of prohibition is to create ever more dangerous substances that put us at greater risk and generate mountains of wealth for organized crime in illicit networks. Of course, that also sustains precisely the traditional growers through illicit economies, but that's no walk in the park, right? So we need to keep a lot in our heads at the same time as we go about the making the coca review a success. And on that note, finally, part of the story, I think, is much of the reason why coca has been almost stricken from our awareness is the role that the United States government has played over these decades. In 1992, the WHO found, without any new evidence, that yes, coca belongs in this strictly controlled list, not because of the previous reason that it's addictive, but because cocaine is easily extractable from the leaf. All right? So it was a new argument, but it was based on no evidence, and it's clear that the United States is taking that line. In the mid-90s, there was another WHO study that basically found coca is completely healthful, has no risks, and when they were going to publish this, the US said, They buried the publication. So now, after all these years, this is the first critical review that will provide the possibility of these recommendations. In the meantime, the US has shown its hand time again, blocking Bolivia from trying to re-enter the treaties with a reservation just for Bolivia around decriminalizing and legal markets for coca leaf. So we need to be aware that the US is likely to play, or try to play, a blocking role in the success of this coca campaign, for all that that implies. So especially for those of us who are privileged to and powered by our ability to affect US policy, I think we need to make that part of the story.
I was going to say something similar, but from a little different angle, just that there be more attention played to the connection between psychedelics and other drug policy reform, especially as it relates to the individual. I don't think, there's different groups of people use different substances, and they use them for different reasons. There may be political opportunity to allow people to expunge a record for a conviction for possession for cannabis or psychedelics, but there's no moral reason or policy reason why that's more important than allowing someone with a conviction for heroin or cocaine to get employed, have a protected immigration status, or not have their children taken away. It all comes from the same place. Like, that's the connection, I think, the war on drugs and the adoption of these policies. And we've chosen, the drug policy movement is now moving forward sort of in a piecemeal fashion, drug by drug, and there's concern around that about which ones we move forward with first and who the users of those substances are, and why there's the political opportunity there. And so I think more intentionality and attention and media attention to the fact that it's actually it's coming from the same place, the same universe, and it's the same impact on people for other substances and their lives and communities, so that we don't forget that.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up other substances outside of psychedelic materials. The New York Times just reported that allegedly, according to the Times, fewer Guatemalan farmers are growing poppies because the fentanyl business, according to the reporters, has moved to Mexico, where they're using, allegedly, Chinese materials to develop and produce fentanyl. in labs in Mexico and then export it to the US. Here in this city, more than 800 people died of fentanyl overdoses last year. So these are important data points to reflect on. Any thoughts about that particular story?
Yeah, just, yeah, I mean, I think we were one of the major backers of Measure 110. You know, totally believe that we need to end the drug war and people struggling with addiction. It's like, you know, if your uncle's struggling with alcoholism, you don't call the cops to arrest them, you get them into treatment. You know, we have to really shift how we think about people who struggle with addiction, then stop stigmatizing. I mean, generally they're medicated, self-medicating emotional pain and trauma. And yeah, like what's, you know, so, but then with 110, you know, like just unpacking all the lessons, and I don't pretend to be the super expert on it, but just at a high level, you know, it seems like one, of course, the houselessness crisis, and we need to be addressing, like, you know, systemic problems in our society and social support generally, alongside decriminalization. And then I think safe supply probably has to be part of the next round of legislation, and we know that's like a harder lift, but really from a public safety standpoint, you know, having a safe place, you know, ideally, like you have a safe supply, and someone who's like addicted to heroin can manage that like a diabetic manages with insulin until they're ready to go into the Ibogaine clinic that's co-located right there, and you know, and just like have this like much more comprehensive approach. Yeah, I mean, it's you know, it's an absolute disaster, and you know, unfortunately, the right wing is, you know, unpacking 110 in their preferred prohibitionist way. But yeah, I know at MAPS we actually are already talking internally about what it could look like for, you know, MAPS to be potentially a source of safe supply in the years to come. And yeah, Carl Hart was on our board for a bit. He was busy, but we definitely have that ethos in our, you know, DNA as an organization. And you know, Chris Lawlicker, founder of SSDP, you know, which is, you know, very much a end the drug war organization. And so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely, we need to address this and stop all the harms of the drug war here at home and around the world. You know.
Thank you. Anybody else want to take that on?
Just on the fentanyl point in particular, and again on the U.S. role, the Biden administration is leading something called the Global Coalition to Address Synthetic Drug Threats. So it's packaging it not just as fentanyl, but other so-called threats such as tramadol. So the counterpoint is proposals, especially among Republican members of Congress and candidates, that the U.S. should take such an aggressive posture toward Mexico as to lob missiles or send special forces, invade the country to somehow stop the cartels from producing fentanyl. Obviously, that should be a non-starter. It should be absurd on its face, but it's getting traction and political space within a party that may once again be in position to make those decisions from the White House. So I think we need to pay attention to these narratives around the drug war at the same time, and be clear that if the fentanyl tragedy means anything, it needs to bring this profound rethink of the drug war, because it shows to those willing to look how preposterous the goals of the drug war are to begin with, and it makes the harms so apparent across the board. So safe supply is urgent, but even that seems like a heavy lift. And if the narrative shifts to a doubling down, not just on the old drug war, but a new drug war, where the possibility of an interdiction approach and eradication is almost absurd to think about, because we're not talking about localized crops. We're talking about something that's completely footloose. I think the harms that can still be generated by a drug war 2.0 focused on synthetics are perhaps even more severe than those we've been talking about, but have been built in now to our politics.
Thank you. All right, I think we'd like to take some questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you for this, I really enjoyed it. I wanted to talk about something, Tamar, you were referring to in terms of including diverse and marginalized communities, kind of at the beginning, middle, and end of the political or developing policies. And I wanted to ask about, the government system does not work well with the pace at which marginalized communities typically organize amongst each other. And furthermore, the work that we ask for marginalized communities to do on these advisory boards are typically unpaid. And so as a result, it's very difficult for people of BIPOC or marginalized communities to get involved in these advisory boards because it's unpaid labor. So how do we get around that piece and really ensure that it is equitable the way that we're including marginalized people in the beginning and middle of the process, knowing that the government system has a different pace than how BIPOC communities typically organize as well?
Yeah, it's a very challenging question, and I think, as Victor said, it's like not unique to this issue. It's a struggle in all sorts of policy reform. I think we should, on a larger level, start exploring more options that are outside of what we've done in the past. We set up the committees so they're non-paid. They don't have to be. You could invest money in communities to develop processes for participation, policy development that's funded. It's really hard. I've noticed from doing cannabis and then other drug policy legislation, it's a lot easier when you have something that's revenue generating than spending money, because a lot of people are on board with the idea, but then where does it come from? So you have to explore that as well. I actually think cannabis, there's some interesting ways to think about using some of that funding. 110 in Oregon, which now has been repealed and parts of it didn't work, that was actually using some of the cannabis tax revenue for that further policy reform. So maybe there's ways, especially parts that goes back into communities to help develop those processes. But I think it'd probably be best if they were even broader beyond drug policy and beyond this issue to develop a new model for it. One other thing that I think about is the pace of reform that we go. So there's always a feeling of urgency about it. It feels like we're always behind, right? Even when it's like we're planning a ballot initiative 4 years from now, it's like, oh my God, we're already behind. And then by the time you get there, you're even more behind. And then part of that, it's always the case because a political opportunity presents itself, and then you think, oh, the window will close if we don't get on it now. But I do think, and this is also a reflection back on cannabis, other reforms, maybe it's better to just go slower and take longer and have a much longer on-ramp and development process, and maybe you, and a lot of it's unknown, maybe you end up with a better product in the end if you do that than if you rush it. There's also arguments in some cases you need a rush to get the first win, and then there's a time frame to develop it. And I've seen a lot of laws improve over time. You get past the hurdle of it's adopted and then it improves. Other times it's kind of locked in and very hard to improve, or other funded interests come in to lobby and make it worse. But just that pace is something that I don't know the answer to, but that I struggle with, that maybe it's just better to go much slower, but you have to also not lose the momentum or not lose the political window, because at times it definitely shifts, and and there's the pendulum swings back, which we're seeing now on some drug policy, and reform becomes harder. But we do rush things to try and seize opportunities and miss a lot in the process.
Can I just add something here? I think, a lot of times when we're having these conversations about policy, folks will say, let's get it across the finish line, and then we'll figure out with philanthropy how we can get access for BIPOC communities. And I think, what would it look like if we took, because then that creates a situation where then communities of color or historically excluded communities are reliant on just philanthropy, and when that philanthropy dries up or that effort dries up, then people don't have access. What would it look like to front load that funding, that philanthropy funding at the front end, and say, let's include folks, let's pay them, let's bring them on so that they can help inform the policy from the beginning, and then when it's implemented, we won't have to rely on ongoing philanthropy all the time to be able to get those communities what they need. it'll be kind of like baked into what we develop. So.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I have two questions. One is for Victor, and the other question would be for Tamar. I own and operate one of the biggest training centers for psilocybin facilitators in Oregon. 47% of licensed facilitators come from our school. 97% are white people. And I think you bring in a very important point of organizations like myself getting involved with local communities. And do you have any tips how can my organization get involved with local communities in Oregon? Because we tried, and so far it's really difficult to relocate those who have ability to participate in reformation of policies in Oregon. And the second question for Tamar is, what are your view on the impact of federal legalization of psilocybin on local communities and licensed centers in states like Oregon and Colorado? And same for cannabis.
Yeah. I'm hearing your question correctly. You're working in Oregon and trying to engage with communities and want to know how to be able to do that because you've tried and it hasn't kind of caught on. So I think primarily, from my perspective, the first thing to do is to start to do decolonial work and anti-oppressive work within your organization and bring folks in to the organization that have connection and relationships with those communities that could then support building those relationships. And I say, like, starting to do that decolonial work internally. And I know that's, we can spend a long time unpacking what that means. But creating safety for the folks that you're bringing in so that they're not coming in to be tokenized or overworked or used as kind of like a front to get to those communities, and actually creating a space where it's inclusive, anti-oppressive, decolonial, and a safe environment for folks to thrive in. And then those folks can then support the organization in really building out what it looks like to connect with those communities. And so unless there's the practice of decolonization and really like walking in accountability as an organization, the folks that do represent those communities, that have the ability, the capacity to reach them, won't come in because they don't trust the organization. And unless the people from the community see themselves reflected in the organization and see the track record and the integrity with which they do their work, they also won't trust the organization to connect with them. So I think it starts with like internal work of really exploring what are the ways the organization might be because we all replicate systems of oppression within whatever organizations we're in. White supremacy, patriarchy, like you name it, we all replicate it. And so looking at those things and deconstructing them and working internally to create an environment that then creates safety to reach out to those communities in a way that's in integrity.
On the second question, I think the answer to that depends a lot on what federal legalization looks like. So I think in the context of psilocybin or psychedelics, if we're talking about federal legalization and that it's like approval for it to be used as a medicine in a certain condition, I think it likely has little impact on the state programs like Oregon and Colorado unless it changes the federal government's orientation to those programs now that it's legally available or federally regulated, so they take a different approach that's sort of less hands-off, and that changes it. Were they to just, and this is more likely in the context of cannabis, with cannabis, if they just legalize it like they did with hemp/CBD, and they're like, it's descheduled and we're out, it's gonna be mad chaos. I mean, it's gonna change everything related to the state programs because, as you can see with the completely unregulated hemp CBD market, it's everywhere, it's not tested, it's not licensed, you don't even know if what you buy in CVS has THC in it or CBD or a bunch of other stuff. You have no idea. And competes against the state-regulated markets in a way, and consumers don't know what they're getting. Also, all the state cannabis markets are completely designed and operated as intrastate systems as a part of the DOJ's original guidance and federal prohibition. They were set up that way. Once federal illegality goes away, they no longer can legally have intrastate markets. It has to be interstate, but all the licensing and testing and everything is set up to be completely intrastate. So it will change everything. And I think with a lot of serious consequences for equity programs that states have developed that are built upon the idea of there being an ability to control the market or favor certain types of licenses within the state market. So the federal government could also legalize in a different way where they choose to protect certain parts of state programs or to say we're going to allow for intrastate commerce in these contexts, or we're actually going to regulate it, and we're going to regulate it in this way that contemplates and considers what states' programs do. And then it will be slightly less chaotic, but it will be a very big shift. But I think if we're talking about something more limited in this context where certain psychedelics become legal under FDA in certain contexts, will have a less dramatic effect unless it changes enforcement priorities for the state programs for right now.
You know, I just wanted to share just one more relevant thing I forgot about improving safety in the unregulated, decriminalized context. Is Chacruna is actually developing with Jamie Beachy, board chair, who also designed Naropa's psychedelic training program, a certification program for ceremonial leaders who often are not inside a formal church organization. By and large, most ceremonies are not in that kind of formal structure, but a seeker could look, in looking for a ceremony to sit with and engage with medicine, could, look to see if that particular ceremonial leader had is holding a certificate. They've completed this training and just basic ethics and how to optimize safety, minimize harm in their circles, and then also would be part of a community of accountability of certificate holders. So that's a really exciting way of that Chacruna is addressing this and up-leveling that decriminalized context, which then should make it much more palatable to pass at the statewide level.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Elsa. I want to invite you to maybe help us paint a picture of hope, not in the details of engaging with the legal system where it's a linear, logical, mind-driven process, and the legal system is a product of patriarchy and all those things that we actually want to change. And whenever I take questions about how to change something outside to a medicine ceremony, the medicine show me that it's always from within and how I can change myself, and I integrate that outward. So I'm curious about all of you where your life's work is at that point, like doing this work. Have you ever taken that intentional question to a ceremony or a psychedelic experience? And what did you learn from it? What lessons were you given? And how do you integrate that in your very, normal day-to-day policy-making world? And I'm hoping to get some inspirations from all of you because of the dedication and commitment that you have. Thank you.
I've worked in policy for a little bit, maybe a couple years, and I always, I kind of have a little bit of a tough time with these conversations because they feel a little bit like, I know that they're necessary, but they feel a little bit outside of what I actually want to do. And like my work in this space and where I've come to, I was talking about organizationally, like having to do that decolonization work, that anti-oppressive work, that like internalized homophobia, like all of that, right? That starts on a personal level. And so it's particularly with the communities that I work with, it's like they are like, what are you actually doing? How are you embodying all of the shit that you're talking about and this beautiful future that you're imagining? Like, how are you actually living that? How are you actually embodying that? And so for me, the way that I try to show up in the policy space or as a therapist or as a educator is hopefully a reflection of the ways that I show up for my wife at home, for my child, for my 11-year-old who's here with me. Yeah, and I think that's how we deconstruct the systems that are there, because like politics is not designed for you to show up in your humanness. You know, and these conversations sometimes don't, because we're here, right? We're not like embodied, we're not, you know, senators don't want to hear about your spiritual awakening. So like there's just, you know, but there are ways in which like you can stay in integrity with that. And so for me, the reason why I focus so much on storytelling, one is because I think like you need that. I was in DC a few months ago, supporting some lobbying that was happening around the Breakthrough Therapies Act, and I went into this office with this like conservative Republican House representative, and I'm with their staffer, and I mentioned how I worked for Tom Wolfe, and that didn't land very well, and but at some point, the way that we connected with this particular staffer was that his mom is part of like Mushrooms for Moms in Utah, right? And so like the reason why I push and I like focus so much on storytelling, because that's the space in the policy world where you can bring all of that and also impact and like disrupt the structure. So for me, it's like, how do I embody, how do I bring my story, how do I make space for as many stories to come into that space and really like shock the system and move it in a way that feels grounded.
Yeah, just add, I mean, it's a hard slog in the moment here, and this is a you know, generational shift, generations, hopefully not too many more. But in some of my biggest medicine experiences, I've seen, I remember in Ibogaine, I was in low Earth orbit and seeing like the Earth and, you know, all the activists and artists and everyone, you know, fighting the machine, and, you know, are we going to win, or is, you know, we going off the climate change cliff, and all the corporatocracy, you know, Trump, fascist forces, you know, what's going to happen? And, you know, at a certain point saw like golden light, you know, feeling interdimensional presences plugging in, and you know, just helping this earth, you know, to kind of get through this, adolescent period we're in, to like get to that, you know, heaven on earth, you know, and you know, like how do we move things in a good way to, you know, purge this trauma, you know, just ricocheting down the generations from colonialism and slavery, and, you know, but feeling like there's a lot of forces in this existence that are pushing that way. And you know, to Martin Luther King, you know, he said, you know, the arc of history is long, but yeah, bends towards justice. And yeah, so I believe it. You know, it's hopefully not too much longer, but I don't know if we're going to live to see it, unfortunately. Yeah.
You know, in a slightly different mode, but I think, and this is as much a cognitive, intellectual as it is as a spiritual and reckoning of this saying applies to you, me, everybody, is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think these conversations the last couple of days have shown me how important it is to check and to be open to the counter argument and to aspects that you didn't take into account. Because even if let's say you succeed in doing what you would like to achieve, what are some unintended consequences, potentially beneficial, but also potentially negative, that you need to take into account? And also to recall, and I was recounting the sort of what seemed to us as preposterously white supremacist cultural aggrandizing statements on the part of the people who wanted to denigrate coca and exclude it. To my ears now, they sound ridiculous, but to their ears, they were serving a benign, if not noble, purpose. And I think for me, that's check your own, my own assumptions about not just my motivations, but the consequences of the actions that I'm going to be responsible for. And I think, to me, that's, we heard, for those who heard the comedy piece yesterday, it is genuinely humbling, right? Not just to be, which isn't to say you're proud, you are truly humbled by the acknowledgement of your own limitations. And I think getting in the policy space and politics is to realizing that every person you interact with is also a whole person and brings other experiences that you cannot possibly comprehend in your 5 minutes with them. And to appreciate that as you go in and as you go out at the same time. And I think these kind of conversations that challenge us that way, and your question that challenges us this way, are all part of what to me is essential to being, especially if you fashion yourself in the policy space, to be responsible about it, to have that humility. So thanks for your question.
I don't have that much to add to that. I mean, I agree with that. I think the thing I try and bring to it always, which to me has been the most rewarding part of being in drug policy, is to just try and listen. I feel like sometimes I come to a session or one of these things and I'm like, oh, I've been to one of these so many times. I swear I never fail to learn something new or hear a new perspective that actually changes the way I think about something that I'm concretely working on in a new way. That to me is, personally very, so rewarding that there's always the ability to grow. I feel like it's a long process of a really complicated problem that we're collectively trying to solve together. And each thing I learn pushes me in a new direction and it in a new direction. And so for that, I'm profoundly thankful to be in this space as a career, but also just as a person to be able to learn and to listen and constantly remind myself to listen. And the more I do, the more I learn, and the more my own work gets better. So.
Thank you. We have time for one more brief question with brief answers.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation today. During the ramp up to Prop 122, there was a lot of criticism of the campaign that it didn't do enough to consult community voices and that it was ran by out-of-state actors and kind of subverted the local community. And I think in the Massachusetts ballot initiative, it's received the same criticisms, but even at a higher degree, at least that's my perception from the western side of the country. I'm wondering, there's been a lot of talk today about specifically how campaigns are needing to consult with communities before running them, and I wonder, from an equity perspective, what are the best practices that promoters of psychedelic policy, especially a broad statewide policy, can do to make sure that the local community voices are really being uplifted and supported in the work that they're already doing?
Well, I will just say that, to what Tamar was saying, the window in Massachusetts opened in a, very abrupt way with a few donors, wealthy donors, stepping up to, qualify a ballot measure. And I'm a big passionate believer in decrim. There was real hesitation from the polling to decriminalize all the medicines, and I was involved with conversations with Bay Staters, and ultimately the policy in Massachusetts does include decrim of all medicine. You wouldn't know it from anything. It just sounds like we're running a regulated access program in Massachusetts with no decrim from everything they're publicly saying, but in fact the policy is what we would dream Oregon to have, and yeah, but as far as process, I think sure, unfortunately, that could have been way better, should have been longer. No.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, it's true and I said it in the previous question, the time constraints sometimes work, and you have to make a choice. Is it better to not do it, or is it better to do as much as you can within the time constraints? I always, within the time, I think it's best to reach out as broadly as you can to get as much feedback and input from as many stakeholders as possible. lots of times what you hear and feedback you get is in direct conflict with each other. People don't disagree, but it's always, to the extent you can, the most valuable to hear what everybody needs, where everybody's coming from, to develop the best policy. I mean, one advantage of the legislative route rather than the ballot initiative route is that it it has its own problems. Like, I'll say that with like lobbyists and all those sorts of things, but it builds in a process of where there's just more natural engagement, because even when you reach out, you're reaching out to the people you know, or those people who know, and there's people within a state, the entire state, who like have opinions who and expertise who they can't give. The flip side is that then you are in the state legislative process, and state lawmakers often are not in the same place as voters are willing to go. So they both have their pros and their cons, but sometimes it's a mad race to talk to as many people as you possibly can if the goal is to move forward in a window, and to hopefully build in mechanisms on the implementation side where there's more contemplative expert input and more deliberative non-political process where hard questions can be worked out in implementation.
Anything to add to that, panelists? No?
For me, it's always like, who are the most impacted communities, and who are the organizers there. And of course, there's like constraints sometimes depending on where you're working and what you're working towards. But for me, the best practice is like, go talk to the people, or the people's representative that's been, that they've entrusted with that duty. So, yeah.
Please thank our panelists today.